Begin. Can you guys? Design process. Design tools do more than extend our capacities. I think, as any of us who have worked in design, they shape how we think and move and how we make. So join me in welcoming Humbi to the stage. And afterwards, we'll have a discussion and invite you all to ask Humbi some questions as well.
Thank you so much for the kind words. I can speak to this, right? To this mic now? Okay, perfect. Everyone, thank you so much for coming and joining me for this exhibit opening and the lecture for Unruly Intelligences. It's really been my privilege to have this fellowship opportunity here at University of Toronto Daniels. And it has just been actually stupendous. I have really loved my experience here. I was already excited coming in, but it has far exceeded my expectations. So thank you very much. So as I introduce the kind of work that I've been doing, I'm actually going to first do a quick rewind to 2014. So that's now over a decade ago, more than a decade ago. And so my original professional background before becoming immersed in design technologies is actually in urban landscape architecture firms. And I used to work at Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, MVVA. So that's like 11, 12 years ago, maybe a bit more, where I was asked to start drafting the RFQ and RFP initial submissions for the University of Toronto Campus Core master plan, which is so funny. And so with Elizabeth Silver, principal at MVVA, my main supervisor there, we drafted the initial written proposal with strategies for increasing pedestrian connectivity, rethinking parking that was above ground, et cetera, et cetera. And then anyway, we sent off the document and then crossed our fingers. And little did I know that I would be here teaching more than a decade later, and it's all done. The core, it looks beautiful. And anyway, so here we are, just 3 blocks to the west. So this is another such that kind of scale project from 2016 when I was at Rogers Partners as one of the initial team members for this particular project, which was to cap a highway that bisects the Buckhead neighborhood in Atlanta, Georgia, and to physically stitch the neighborhood area back together through this architectural, urban design, and landscape intervention. And I think they're at the stage of finalizing the funding to go ahead. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how that turns out from these initial renders that we did in 2016. And in the meantime, this experience got me to become extremely curious about the question of human behavior and social interaction in the built environment, especially because there was so much attention given at this design initial scheme stage. We were trying to think about the human-to-human interaction, but also all the different speeds of infrastructure happening all around, right? So there's cars, trains, bikes, overhead bike path, et cetera. And so, in my interest in human behavior and in social interaction, is there a way that the designer can more actively, more playfully, poetically, sometimes subversively manipulate the ways that we occupy space and also interact with each other as human beings? And so I scaled all the way down to creating small-scale architectural installations with an interactive component in order to study this. And so the first work that I'm going to talk about is called The Secret Garden, a collaborative project where this is tucked in behind a serene library and a bustling avenue, where I discovered a secret garden that occupies a curious in-between liminal space. And this is a space that I discovered as a teenager. And so this is, a place that I could kind of go hide out. It's a little oasis. I grew up loving this space. And so, this is behind the library, so the mental association, and also because you see all the greens, you think that's going to be a meditative space. It gives that impression of an ambiance. But actually, a noisy, bustling avenue lies just beyond the brick wall. And so I led the design of this installation to exaggerate this quality of a secret garden where there's an interactive door which is brought in and amplifies the soundscape. So it's an acoustic time-space portal. So when you open the door, the traffic sounds and the cacophony of the city gets amplified as if you open the sound portal. And then when you shut the door, it allows you to shut the noise away. And so to achieve that, essentially, we're using something called physical computing and/or basic Arduino electronics, sensors, actuators. So this is an example that I want to give of computation that has become embedded into the built environment, allowing people to kind of playfully manipulate, playfully make commentary about the spatial qualities that you're experiencing in that space. One more that I'm going to talk about is called Pulses, which I led as a manager at NVIDIA, an associate there, a design firm led by Alan Saye, where I worked for many, many years. And so it was a commissioned project for a summer festival in New York, where it was displayed with and interacted with passersby for summer. And it consists of these 4 concrete 4 feet by 8 feet panels. And you can see 2 of them are a bit more bench-like, and then 2 of them are actually closer to the ground but have these positive imprints of the body. And so the ones that are bench-like have the negative forms of the body, where the idea is you can nestle yourself into these nooks. And it's also a musical furniture. So a long time ago, I used to be a pianist, and so I've always sort of maintained this interest in sound or non-visual senses. So the way this works is it has a component called sound transducers, which turns a material that's adhered to into a speaker through vibration. And so people sitting on this bench experience the sound through bone conduction, through their elbows, through their hip bones, through their bodies. And we collaborated with the sound designer and composer Eric Slater, who created this generative composition that reacts real time. And so through the body, the idea is, you experience the mood of the urban neighborhood kind of through time, like allowing you to viscerally feel the emotions of the body. How do you make something like this? As Robert mentioned, I'm very interested in digital fabrication as well. And so, the mold-making process for this was pretty intense. Included wrapping up Halloween skeletons under layers of fiberglass sheets, hardened by painting on resin. And that's what's helping us get this fabric drapery finish on concrete. And then maybe just to wrap this section up, one more example I'm going to give at much larger scale, bringing back us to master plan scale, is actually the Yerevan Physics Institute master plan called the Loop, where we were hired to propose an initial scheme, a master plan proposal for this kind of dilapidated, slightly abandoned, but some parts are still in use, Soviet-era research campus for Physics Institute. There are 70-plus buildings on this campus, and underneath all of this is actually a large particle accelerator. So it's kind of like the Large Hadron Collider from CERN. You might have heard of it. It's this enormous ring or a loop where protons and ions collide at near light speed, and it's what physicists study to research fundamental particles. And so, this is a kind of a Soviet-era campus with long history of pioneering scientific research, but is basically fallen into disuse. And so we proposed something in which there's this giant gesture of a loop that cuts through many different buildings, but also connects a lot of these buildings through different elevation changes, which happens there. And so it has this feature where when you hold the handle, you can kind of shoot, like as if you're shooting the particles to the next person who might be kind of nearby or kind of brushing against the handrails. So anyway, so with these kind of projects, I think that those can be really interactive, like playful, poetic, subversive ways of manipulating the ways human-to-human behavior, human-to-human interaction can happen in the built environment through computation. And what I want to emphasize is actually my background before doing master's was social sciences. So I didn't come to computational design through studying CS. And so from the get-go, my interest is very much about human behavior. And so I've been teaching related kind of courses here at University of Toronto, further exploring some of these ideas through a series of classes, which I've had the opportunity through partnerships with, for instance, City of Markham, to have some pretty wonderful exhibit opportunities for the students. And so here's some behind the scenes of how it was like to set up. So this is for the summer design build course from last summer, where it resulted in three kind of installations, one of them called The Unfolding, very much inspired by New York's storefront for art and architecture. Another one, okay, I'll go through. Another one called The Zones, which have to do with these inflation-based canopy systems that the longer you're occupying this pavilion and conversing with each other, it'll kind of gradually rise and fall based on human presence and what it's sensing about the environment. And then lastly, Memory of Vessels, or Vessels of Memory, who created this amazing, very immersive environment, architectural space where people could come in with these kind of glowing vases that hold memories of prior occupants of the space, et cetera, et cetera. You can see a bit more about it in the exhibit right there. So yeah, we had this wonderful public opening with just members of the public, friends, family. Anyway, so I really want to thank you, those of you who are here, my beloved students who worked so hard for this. Okay, and so we come to the second section of this presentation. So oftentimes I talk about my work in two ways, and we just saw an example of the first, computation embedded into the built environment experienced by the body. So in this second section, I'm going to be talking about the computation embedded in the tools of design used by the body to design the built environment. And so probably my driving question is, what are the explicit, but also sometimes and very often, the invisible ways that the tools impact the ways we design? And so these tools are kind of wide-ranging, can be from hand tools, digital fabrication machines, software like CAD, Rhino Blender, animation, 3D scanning, AR, VR, simulations, etc. And we get to, these days, generative AI. So what's happening right now? Some pretty crazy things are happening these days, and you probably have seen a little example here and there. And there have been such a burst of activity that I think it's pretty important for us to take a pause and have some moment of reflection about what is its impact on the design process. So I would say, these current advances in generative AI have been confronting our discipline, both architecture and design, with pretty fundamental questions about how we shape and are shaped by tools of design, who gets to shape the built environment. And so I want to give an example of this screenshot I took from Instagram for the hashtag AI architecture. And this is probably about a year ago. And when you take a screenshot of the hashtag, presumably those posts were made by people all over the world. But isn't it a little strange? Like, they actually look quite self-similar, even though the posters themselves were coming from all over. So what's happening here? So, there's various studies that are trying to identify, what characteristics are emerging from these imagery generated by AI. And so I actually think that while at the same time there have been such an interesting burst of potential use of generative AI tools, I also really want to make sure that we are completely mindful of some of the potential problems that also arise with our use of generative AI. One of which has to do with visual cliches, like what I'm observing and pointing out in these images. Second of which has to do with the illusion of knowledge. So when you're able to put in any sort of input and it gives out something somewhat sensible sounding, often you run the risk of presenting an illusion of knowledge, and this obviously has huge implications for education and pedagogy here, right? Thirdly, erasure of individual diversity of perspectives, just like this example of the hashtags from all over the world, kind of being oddly self-similar. Fourthly, maybe flattening of materiality and three-dimensionality. Generative AI is notoriously not very good at understanding physics or gravity. And so when it's integrated in the design process, what issues are arising there? And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, what I end up focusing on is design fixation, which is a phenomenon where when you first see a possible solution to a design problem, it can be really hard for you to then think of alternative ideas. And what's happening with a lot of very commercially popular generative AI tools today is that you put in some random input, you get an output, the output looks sensible, and now you've seen it, so it's so hard for you to think about, okay, wait, can I forget that I saw that, and then rethink what were my initial constraints, what were my stakeholder interests, things like that. And so, if there's this common use of using generative AI where it's very much kind of give me the answer, I'm actually wondering, can we call back to an earlier history of computational design and architecture? So similar challenges have come to us where anytime there's new technological development in architectural tools, we have had to deal with similar questions. And so early human-centered, so human-computer interaction, HCI, there was already once a significant shift where we were trying to, as a discipline, rethink computational tools as not just tools to deploy, but objects to think with in a Seymour Papert constructionist learning theory kind of way, or in a Nicholas Negroponte kind of way, where he says, quote, he says, computing is not just seen as a tool for representing or fabricating, but very interested in how computation could be something to think with, right? But I do really want to emphasize, though, like there are, while we can learn from history, there are some fundamentally new things happening with generative AI. One of which is when AI tools can deliver polished appearing results with minimal engagement sometimes, especially those have some kind of like societal or cultural meaning embedded in them, because of that, these are kind of a new class of tools and previous computational design tools that we have dealt with in this discipline. And so I think both are pretty important to keep in mind. So one of the main things that I find pretty frustrating about using generative AI tools in the design process is that it can feel mismatched with the human design intentions and workflows. One way I describe this is, we design in a very discursive, nonlinear way. We get inspiration from all sorts of things. We're mulling on a problem, and then you wake up and you see something, you're like, oh, wait, that was the perfect solution to my studio project problem. Or you have conversations with critics or other stakeholders, and there's all sorts of new inputs coming in. And in this sense, I think it's actually a pretty nonlinear process. And I think one of the reasons there can be such a mismatch is the issue of type of inputs. And so, these inputs these days often ask for something like text or an image, right? And by using this kind of tools, the designer is forced to compress so much information into just text or image. But actually, we rely a lot on embodied tacit knowledge about materiality, contextual understanding about culture and history, and architecture and design are actually very embodied practices. Designers think through making, learn through material experimentation, generate knowledge through haptic feedback, and as Polanyi said, we know more than we can tell. Much of design expertise is pretty resistant to being written down, and therefore it's really hard for that to become part of the data set that's going into the generative AI. And so one question that I've been exploring is, what are some alternate inputs that make use of bodily intuition or tacit knowledge about how things are put together in the physical realm and how things are experienced by the human body in the physical realm? And so in our Arcadia 2025 paper, we've been establishing a theoretical framework for categorizing these different models of human-AI interaction that I am observing as existing out there in the design process. And I do think that there's many more than this, but let's first start with the direct method. So direct is sort of the most commonplace method that exists today, right? So the one click, you click the generate button, the human person, the user here, puts in maybe some text and image, and then you get out the final solution. Okay, well, that exists. I feel a little bit like there must be better alternate ways of using generative AI. So secondly, what I've been exploring is something called real time, where human and AI interact real time and in incremental steps instead of getting out the final solution immediately. You'll see some examples where I explore that further later on. Number 3, I think there might be something that's more iterative, more nonlinear, where human and AI interact kind of with an ability to review and rewind to prior steps. And so again, that's trying to get this issue of, the design process is not A to B, it's like this. So I'll show you some example of that too. And so, the initial attempts at doing the direct method, you get out images like this. You've seen images like this plenty of times. They do raise some interesting questions where, for instance, the ability to generate these sort of uncanny images of architectural model making photography. Okay, like there's some sort of like shuffling happening about what usually we used to think as like the order of events that happen during the design process. Okay, so these are some of the experiments in real time that I've been doing along with some of my students. So for instance, this is a marker board sketching tool where you're able to kind of draw environmental landform shaping, and it reacts and you can erase and you can kind of see these iterative AI suggestions, but they're never the final solution. It's just a way for you to quickly see the three-dimensional molding. Here's another example with Jessica Chan here, who was making use of my methodology where I was very interested in using webcam, where a person is able to physically assemble model-making materials together. So what's happening is the input is now also making use of your own understanding of how things can actually stand, or in what ways you might want to arrange like parts of a bench, right? And then generative AI kind of estranges this. It introduces ideas that maybe you might not have thought of before, but it's also a pretty different process than I think the one-click method that you have seen before. And so she created this amazing transformable bench that goes from like a single seat to unfolds. So that's one example. So okay, let's go to a bit more architectural scale now. And so in this example, having a hypothetical site next to Boston's Institute of Contemporary Art, we were interested, these students were interested in making use of this like metal architectural assembly. And so they have this physical model that's rotating on a webcam and input in some like inspiration images. So you can see kind of these very strange generative AI imagery that is being created here with this webcam. So in this particular example, there is this like toy metal, and then also Rhino screenshot brought in there. And you might notice in a second that actually then like the Rhino screenshot gets stretched out, or this webcam gets manipulated. You'll see that in a second. So anyway, so you have like some degree of control on what the imagery is being generated. There you go. But it's still pretty unruly. Here we come to the title of the lecture. Here's some other such examples, again with Rhino turntable feature plus this photograph, and then some of the resulting generative AI iterations. So again, these are all examples of that real-time feature where you're getting like slightly estranged design ideation ideas of the next step, but not the final. Here's another pretty interesting example, and another one where with the webcam, you actually have a physical model rotating. There you go. And so from here, what's happening is all of this is happening at the very initial schematic design, physical like concept model design, not at the end, right? So from here, they're creating this concept model. Here's some model photography. One more example like that in the architectural scale. Okay, so this student is very inspired by Sue Fujimoto's exhibit called Architecture is Everywhere, where Sue Fujimoto is using everyday objects like staples, ping pong balls, and putting a scale figure next to it. Okay, actually, it became like very relevant again in generative AI time, right? And so this student tried to find another such everyday object, and then the first step is putting it into Nano Banana, and you see this like pretty remarkable like instant generation. And then from there on, he's teasing out, okay, which element of this am I interested in exploring further, and then ending up with a physical concept model. And again, there's some sort of like shuffling of order that is happening, where from here, then it gives him some sort of initial partie or concept model that you can play around with, this sort of like two-color 3D printing. And then you'll use that to go further in design development. And so even though like very initially he got out these crazy render images from like one click, the idea is not that this is the final, but rather that it's just given some interesting ideas for starting of the concept model. So all of this process originated from 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, in my own initial investigation to this sort of like real time. So as you might have seen out in the exhibit, I had a pretty amazing opportunity to make use of some scrap material from a marble quarry. So I don't know if you've ever been to a marble quarry, but they're enormous. So the scraps are also enormous, but for them, it's discard. Like, they have no use for it. And so there's this artist residency that I was fortunate enough to join that allowed you to make use of it to make a marble sculpture. And so I thought I would make use of that opportunity to test out my first attempt at this real-time AI design process. And so I initially started gesture sketching in VR because another layer of investigation I'm trying to do is I actually kind of want to viscerally feel that kind of push and pull of agency between my own creative direction and the AI's creative direction. And so I thought, okay, actually there's this awesome tool called Gravity Sketch, so I'll try using that. So, earlier I had asked, what are some alternate inputs that make use of bodily intuition? And so this was my initial attempt at that. There you go. So, those are some such examples. You can see, so on the left panel of those lower videos is what I'm drawing in VR, and the right panel is the very quickly refreshing generative AI imagery. And so as I'm seeing that, I see certain things I like, and I see certain things that I don't care about. And so I just try to incorporate a little bit of what I like. And that's essentially the design process that I used for that marble sculpture. And so there you go. So that's the marble scrapyard. And so basically from that on, and then I bring it to Rhino, three-dimensionalize it. Again, there's this funny, this flat image that became 3D, and I have to kind of acknowledge that limitation while also pushing against it. And so then, anyway, it got finalized, was milled by this robotic arm. And after the robotic milling arm only takes a day and a half to do this, and then it took me a month to do all the hand sanding. So anyway, you can see this over there, I think, in the exhibit. Okay, and then, so moving on from the real-time section, I think there's also maybe a different paradigm that we could further explore. So I've just started to do so, called nonlinear. And so this is a tool that we developed that shows an example of that kind of nonlinear model of human-AI interaction. And so the human designer here is working in a standard 3D modeling design software that they already feel comfortable with. So it might be Rhino or Blender for someone in our discipline. And the generative AI use is instead through a plugin. So in this case, we're not going to some other website, and then getting the output and bringing it in. This is something that's kind of natively happening in the software you already feel comfortable with and have some handle on how to express yourself, right? And so the idea is this plugin is something that you can use intermittently. So on the left panel, it actually kind of keeps track of a time-lapse sequence of your prior steps. And you can kind of mix and match and get AI-generated visual variations of select moments. Again, very interested in not getting the final output, but something that's just a little bit outside of how you might usually think, something provocative, but not divorced from your own intentions. Okay, so anyway, that's sort of the examples of those alternate methods of human-AI interaction that I think we should be exploring as a discipline, because there is, I think, a universe out there that we could be exploring beyond the one click. And I actually want to do a quick rewind. So this is actually from 2019, where I was developing this series of generative 3D printing buildings, where I was posing this question, in this future, what if machines decide to build architecture according to an algorithmic logic unbeholden to human sensibilities or architectural history? What does a structural column mean to a 3D printer that reads G code rather than Palladio's 4 books of architecture? And this is a project I never used to talk about in talks, but recently, because of generative AI, it became really relevant again. And so what's happening is, in these studies, the the 3D printer has been hacked with a set of rules so that it's generating a randomized assortment of support structures that are radically changing the shape of the design. So my input is just the same series of simple boxes, but the 3D printer is kind of improvisationally generating different series. And so here is sort of in the building scale, in a hypothetical scenario. Here's one kind of individually where, again, it's the same series of boxes, but each time there's a kind of sense of improvisation from the 3D printer. And then I kind of have this final series of little vignettes. So this is kind of like design fiction vignettes to tell the story, right? So this is called Drunk Drones. 3D printing drones print columns in its own architectural style and aesthetics, depending on their mood at the time. Bot Nursery. A human designer looks after a group of social robots. Us versus them. Robots and people cohabitate with varying degrees of cordiality. And lastly, a love story. Furniture snuggle where the humans are away. This is a love story of the camera and the couch. So anyway, it feels funny to look back on that now because of the relevance in certain ways. So for instance, this idea that the 3D printer doesn't know what column means, where in the architectural history context, columns are laden with meaning and all the history. And there's something similar happening with generative AI tools today. But then secondly, what I want to mention is, suddenly since then, it almost seemed a little naive to look back at those projects because the issue of anthropomorphism with AI has become so fraught. And so this idea of kind of calling machines as having agency or assigning some kind of moods or et cetera, now feels like, oh, that feels pretty problematic now because it is having so much more decision-making power than you previously did. And so maybe we can have a further discussion about that in the Q&A. And so here we come to the final section of this presentation, where I also want to highlight that using these interactive tools of design, previously you saw some examples where physical computing is embedded into the built environment. It created these interesting interactive installations. They're making kind of commentary or reacting to climate. But there's something else happening that's a little bit powered by some generative AI tools or machine learning models rather than maybe generative, where actually now we can incorporate the body a little bit more directly in the design process. And so here's also some examples. Also, thank you, my wonderful students, where this particular project group is using Touch Designer to think about the idea that your postures and whether it's just one person in front of it or multiple people, it's kind of impacting, so it's creating this computational design process, right? It's like a twist on the maybe more traditional parametric design, where just with your movements, rather than you literally figuring out how to do everything in Grasshopper, you're able to affect some of these more procedural ways of designing. And so, that results in this interactive installation called Posture to Prospect, where during the exhibit, these wonderful people are able to kind of move and see this claw-like mechanism create this responsive architecture. Here's another example of that kind of interactive design process being using the bodily experience in the beginning stages. So in this particular project, using a webcam, you're able to just draw these sort of patterns, which then, through this P5.js code, gets translated into this kaleidoscopic pattern, which is then woven human and machine by this AxiDraw, and then it becomes panels that you can install onto this pavilion. Some other such wonderful examples, some of which you can see some photos or modules over there in the exhibit. And so I just want to close with a final concept, theory of embodied cognition, which I think is kind of a nice way to wrap up some of the main ideas that I've been trying to present in this lecture. So embodied cognition, which is an idea that comes from cognitive sciences and neuroscience, has had a huge impact on HCI, so human-computer interaction in design. And so some of these principles have to do with, number one, interacting with tools changes the way we think and perceive. Number two, we think with our bodies, not just with our brains. 3, we know more by doing than by seeing. 4, there are times when we literally think with things. And so I think that these 4 ideas have pretty major implications for how we should be thinking about the design process, especially in all the recent developments of interactive systems, both generative AI and not. And so I will wrap that up with a heartfelt thank you to University of Toronto, to these fellowships, my phenomenal students, my amazing exhibit assistants, the amazing support and funding that I've been able to have, and photographers and videographers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Humbi.
Thank you. Yeah?
I hope you have the energy to talk a little bit. It's always such a pleasure to see distilled in a lecture all the different work that colleagues are doing, and to really get that kind of immediate sense of the scope of their work. And it was truly exciting to see all that you've done.
Thank you.
I had a nice chance to chat with you in front of your exhibit before the lecture tonight. So that gave me some thoughts on some of the things I thought we could chat about before turning the questions out to the audience. It's also something that I've been thinking about for a while, which is I do think, just kind of a premise for the questions, that there was a watershed change in the way that we relate to tools that we use for design with the advent of AI and some of the tools that you're using from even the early, let's say the first generation of digital tools. That first generation of digital tools, like say, that became widespread in the 90s, and even through permutational design, still largely duplicated the ability of the hand to guide very purposefully the formation of shapes, forms, lines, and so forth. But much of what you're working with now involves some degree of black box translation, I think. I think that the gestures may be a little bit different, but nevertheless still so there. It's very extreme in the word prompt AI design techniques, where you have to describe what you want. AI using a large language model generates images. You refine your prompts until you get close to what you sort of think you want. But it forgoes almost everything that had to do with eye-hand coordination and design intent. You're bringing it back, it seems to me, through this, I guess, reincorporation of gesture. But it does seem to me that this is my question for you. It does seem quite important to you, and I think you've more or less said as much, that there is still a degree of unpredictability, that through the digital nature of the tool, that nevertheless it's responsive to the body, but there is a certain amount of unpredictability in how it translates your gesture into forms that eventually become artifacts. That seems a kind of core interest of yours. And if you agree with that, I wonder if you can say more about that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I have maybe like 2 parts to the response.
Okay.
First of which is I think that maybe CAD is a little bit more directly translation of what you were doing.
Mm.
But I do think that even from the 90s and on, there have been a lot of computational design tools where that process started getting a little estranged. And therefore, you were more designing maybe like the design workflow or designing the set of parameters that procedurally create some sort of output, but it's not such an obvious translation. So I do think that this is not coming from a vacuum. There is a longer history of such tools. And then secondly, regarding what you're observing about uncontrollability, I think that's the term you used. Yes, I'm definitely very interested in that. And I think that is one of the main things that is so difficult because what's happening with generative AI is you want to have some degree of control, but there is something exciting about the outputs that are slightly out of your control. So how do you strike that right balance? The exciting part being maybe like its potential to help you brainstorm in ways that you might not previously have done. And then another thing is, I think a lot of generative AI use, so there was recently a paper, I think, that was saying that generative AI increased creativity on the individual level, but decreased it a lot on a societal level, right? Because everyone's using the same tools. And I think that actually ties quite a bit to the uncontrollability question. Because, like, how do you maintain, okay, so let's say you're an individual person, you kind of want to have a wider range of outputs than you did previously. And so you're interested in using it, but you don't want it to be part of this, like everyone has this.
Your grid.
Yeah, so anyway, I think that's where the challenge is. That's why I'm trying to explore this real-time model that I think helps me thread that line a little bit better. But it also has a lot of problems and challenges too. So I don't have a final answer. But anyway, this is my attempt to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this also, this question in another way as well, which is, as a design teacher myself, sometimes I think when working with students that the question of what they want, knowing what they want, is challenging for them. And so sometimes procedural strategies allow them to forego answering that question. I mean, there's something about well, let me just say, let's say drawing by hand, drafting, or even drafting digitally or modeling in traditional ways digitally, like say a Rhino model, all of those techniques still, they require decision of a certain sort. I think they have, they have a quality of decision or decisiveness, and you have to decide what you want. But through the techniques of gesture and translation, moving from what it means to gesture with a mouse or a pencil or a pictograph in the old days, to larger muscular motions, seems to it moves categorically. It moves into a different category, especially when you have the machine then translating those gestures. And I guess, sometimes I have trouble making my thoughts questions, but there is something about this difficulty of decision that is resolved by relying upon gesture and then machine translation. And it may have to do with, I just wonder if it has to do with a kind of desire to postpone or to entertain uncertainty about outcomes and goals that is somehow crucial now for many designers.
When you mentioned earlier that you've observed your students have trouble with decision making, and so they're relying on some procedural steps.
Yeah, they want to. Yes.
Yeah, they want to. It's funny that you mentioned that. So I do think that that phenomenon is way exacerbated by generative AI, where oftentimes people want it to tell you what to do next. And so they might put in some input, it's pretty rough, it gets out an output, and then and sometimes students or designers use that to design decisions, but it wasn't really your design decision. And I have noticed that while that is a problem, it actually starts getting pretty easy to distinguish which student initially came in with a strong concept before engaging with these tools, and which students didn't. And so I think that, so anyway, I do think that the problem that you observed earlier, it's happening right now with generative AI, but there's also ways to address that. And I do think that it gets pretty obvious as they go further in the design development process. How strong was their initial concept? So anyway, I'm not sure if I'm totally answering your question about gesture part.
No, I mean, I don't know if there's quite the, yes, I think you did well on that. I mean, but I do think it's almost like, also almost like a form of iconoclasm, a dislike for the image, and that if you can arrive at it through procedures, then it's not based upon an a priori set of goals about what does a building look like, or the old-fashioned question of in what style shall we design. This is not the question. You get to produce it through other techniques. But what I found so interesting what you just said about what you've discovered with your students is that in this arena of proceduralism, I'll call it, that the ones who have the strongest idea of what they want produce the best outcomes anyway.
I have noticed that, like, even a week or two further into the design process, you can start to have some discernment.
Anyway, I will open it up to the audience if anybody has questions for Humbi. Thank you so much, though. Anybody? I see one in the back, maybe.
So since we're on the topic of, I think this is a very broad topic because you kind of listed bodies, tools, AIs, but you're kind of, I think the presentation is focusing on architecture.
On what?
Architecture and designing. So since we're talking about unpredictability and that we're in an educational setting, how does the University of Toronto handle or manage when you're using artificial intelligence to perhaps design something and then two students get the same outcome at the same time? And would that be considered plagiarism? And how do you think you as an institution would account for that, or even be able to administer copyright laws into that, because we're talking about unpredictability? So as you as an institution, have you put in policies, or have you already experienced students coming out with the same design, using the same software? And are there any case studies on how you as an institution have dealt with that? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I can't speak as a representative of the University of Toronto. I'm fairly new here, actually. So maybe that's something that our dean can't answer. But to address some other parts of your question, I think that in design curriculum and our specific pedagogy, especially here at University of Toronto, but in all architecture disciplines, and I will say that because I'm a faculty member in architecture, that's why the focus is in architecture. In all of our curriculum, there's almost no case in which the final outcome will just be what is directly coming out of generative AI. It's just not possible because of the amount of design development that happens through the studio, the kind of course type that exists here, process. essentially, like there are rounds of presentations, there's rounds of many different media of material that gets into your presentation. So a single image will almost never be the final outcome. There's a lot of model making, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe about the idea that two students end up with the same thing. Is this an issue? Yes, it's definitely an issue. I think this one of the main reasons it's an issue is because there's no, that's pretty much an indication that you, as a, let's say, a student's own like design authorship is completely missing from the outcome, right? That's, that would definitely make for a pretty bad project. So in that sense, I think it seems clear to me that would be a problem.
Don't you think that that outcome is even more unlikely in an AI-generated design environment than otherwise? Because, as you're saying, I mean, even the same inputs will result in different outcomes many times.
Well, actually,
things could be very similar, but
it actually can end up in the same outcome, like you Control-C, things like that. But I will say, even if they don't end up with the same outcome, I think it's a problem if they look too similar in the similar way that like that screenshot had shown of hashtags in Instagram, right? If I see those kind of outcomes as the very end final project, then I don't feel like the students' input or like design decisions had much room in their project at all. Like I would find that to be a problem.
Are there more questions out there? Oh, up front. There's one up there, and then we'll come up front.
Thank you. I'm not an architect at all, but I appreciate, thank you for the presentation. I couldn't help, in each of the three kind of paradigms that you outlined of human and AI interacting in the design process, I guess I felt a layperson anxiety of a form of intelligence that has never experienced touch is now co-constructing what I think is, you know, the sacred responsibility of architects and designers of creating the spaces that hold us and house us and these sanctuaries where we can gather. And I struggle with the idea of that becoming kind of like a co-conspirator in building when it's never experienced tactility at all. And so I guess, and you both in the Q&A started talking a bit about your pedagogy, and I wonder, as these tools inevitably become more and more factored into the design and process, what, you know, rather procedural and intentional steps need to be put in place for the human intelligence party to understand that their role is to bring in that insight of touch and three-dimensionality. And you had already mentioned that flattening is a real risk here. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So what you mentioned about like this sort of concern or anxiety resonates so strongly with me, and I think that is a major part of why I'm asking some of these questions or doing these investigations. But at the same time, maybe I don't necessarily. Okay, rewinding slightly. So I am very concerned that there starts becoming some sort of weird redefinition of the term intelligence, and maybe that's also why I've been calling this, why I call this like unruly intelligence. Like I kind of want to problematize that term. Intelligence. I think I'm causing a reverb over there. Because I think you're totally right that it doesn't have a lot of like tacit knowledge or knowledge about the physical world. And in fact, like by using some of these terms, we're kind of supposing that it does, but it doesn't quite. So that's number one. Like I do think that some of the more anthropomorphic terms that we use is pretty problematic. Number two is, I do think that there's, I don't know, I'm not really seeing this as machines are going to take over all aspects of humanity. Just from my interactions with my students, for instance, they're already all like pretty concerned or nuanced about the ways that they want to interact with AI. Like they're not really relinquishing all control, especially because they're, I think, like mentioning similar things, right? Like, no, like you want to maintain some sort of human designer agency or tactility. So I think that just because of human nature, like I don't necessarily see society going all the way in the like this dystopian future direction. But maybe I'm being overly optimistic. I don't know.
Can we get the mic front? No.
Okay, you ready for this?
Okay.
So, taking off on the last question, a very interesting human-centered question. None of this work seems to have a soul. None of it seems to have an animus. And I don't think it ever will, nor could it. Now, connected to that thought is that it strikes me that this whole concept is in the equivalent stage where the World Wide Web was in 1995. So how it evolves to create animus and to communicate soul would be an interesting challenge. How you can inject culture, factors like culture. There's enormous differences of culture. Architecture is a universal language, but yet it reflects the cultures in which it's built. So I'm just thinking out loud. Congratulations on a very stimulating package you brought today. I'm thrilled to see this and to think where it could end up in 30 years.
Thank you. It's funny that you mentioned the 1995 discussion because actually I have a close friend whose father was doing masters in architecture just in the beginning of CAD coming out. And I think for his MArch thesis, he tried to use that to make drawings. And that was the criticism that he kept getting from everywhere, all the faculty, right? It's soulless, has no feeling, anima, like where's you in this? And so it's funny that we're like coming back to similar questions today. And also I think probably in a very similar way to how people nowadays do use CAD in a very expressive kind of manner, there is some sort of future in which we can achieve that with AI. I don't know yet exactly what it's going to look like, but I'm very curious to explore this kind of because of similar concerns. And then there was a second part that I wanted to address. But anyway, okay.
Maybe I could turn it off or on. Riffing a little bit on this question, it does seem like there is something about, there were people who were, for instance, with parametric design, who had great expertise, and because of that expertise were able to develop greater control on outcomes. But there was a period when everybody that was using, say, generative components was developing the same kind of system of arrayed cells. They all looked the same because the tool worked a certain way, and without greater dexterity, they would fall into a kind of, it was almost like a style. It was a style, but it was a style that derived from, to some degree, a lack of control. And I don't know about soulless, but there is something, some of this issue has to do, it seems to me, with the fact that a lot of outcomes in AI are filtered through one form or another of a black box over which most users don't have very much control. So they're more like oh, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to come up with the right analogy. Like you drive a car, which it's fine. You don't have to know how the motor works. But when you are drawing in the traditional ways, and I'm not talking about gesturing, but just this question of decision, there isn't so much between you and outcome. Maybe there is, in the sense of architecture eventually leads to others executing in materials a building which will always deviate from the ideal of a drawing. But there is something about the black box nature of many of the instruments that I think that you're working with that creates that indirection at the very minimum. But I think that you consider that to some extent quite like a virtue.
No, I wouldn't say a virtue.
Okay.
It's just a phenomenon that I'm exploring. Yeah.
But I guess maybe I wonder if you had your way, would you develop increasing control over the filter, I suppose, like the fuzz box of sorts?
Yes, but I see why you call it a virtue. Yes and no, I suppose, right? You want to control at which realms you do have total control and at which realms you don't have control. Yeah. So I think that is an important nuance. But actually, I remembered what I wanted to say in response to your question, which also connects to the initial materiality question over there, which is, I think that at the end of your question, you had phrased it as sort of like, at some point there's going to need like an infusion of culture, social context, maybe, I can't quite remember. But the funny thing is actually, I worry about a future where actually technology is running culture and society. Like I would like for that to remain the domain of humans. So actually it would be better, I think, if the reasons we use technology or the ways that we use technology is actually a bit more specifically defined. That, I guess what I'm trying to say is the solution for getting it to be more soulful is not putting everything into the data set. And then one more thing about the materiality question is that, especially when we're talking about the architectural building process, there are just so many people involved. Who's going to live there, who's building it, contractors, stakeholders, who's paying for it, who's designing it. And in that sense, I think that's also kind of a protection from maybe some of the fears that you were expressing earlier. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it seems though that there's also, because there is a history of, call it proceduralism, like a desire to, I guess, forgo the immediate decision of authorship. That there is a history, whether, I don't know, it's like, say a Kurt Schwitter's sculpture, it's one thing after another. I mean, he's still using his eye, but it's not as if the advent of these digital tools is the first encounter with a desire to evade that feeling of authorship, to sort of ride a wave of sorts. I mean, it's like dipping yourself into a nature and you don't know what the outcome is or how your interaction will end up, which is kind of, sort of your postponement of self.
Okay, so it's funny you mentioned that, and I think that the way you talked about it just now crystallized something for me, which is that I think there is a distinction between trying to rely on these steps to make design decisions and taking ownership of designing the design workflow. And I think that's what I'm interested in, or that's what I've been trying to explore in many of my processes, designing the design workflow, yeah.
Right. There's a question out there.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. So before the questions, you were talking about something that I'd just like to reframe a little bit in a way that I understand better, which is bottom-up design and top-down design, right? where top-down design is where you have this vision, this endpoint, and bottom-up is kind of this more generative way, right? And as designers, we do both, either at the same time or back and forth. And so like you have your vision, you do explorations, various things, maybe the vision shifts, and in the end you kind of meet in the middle, right? And that's your final design. With generative AI, the way I see it, it can only do the bottom up. So then I see that there's this tension, right, where it doesn't know your endpoint really, unless you keep reminding it, right? What I've been thinking about is how do you resolve this tension so it becomes more of a cooperation? Do you use like a second AI that knows this top-down design better, right? Or do you scale back the bottom-up a little bit where you have more control of that? Because it feels to me like generative AI kind of takes control over half of the design process, right? So I don't know, my question I guess is, in thinking of this framework of top-down, bottom-up, is there a better way to control this a little bit? Or have you also noticed any of your students that are frustrated because they have the stronger top-down vision and the AI is kind of sending them off in directions that they know are wrong in a way?
So yes, definitely. There are a lot of students who feel frustrated by this, I think. But I'm actually going to question whether that is the right way to frame generative AI. So I would actually argue that even though what you saw today, my kind of like alternative paradigm, were a lot of bottom up, the reason I'm proposing them as alternatives is because I think a lot of tools are actually way too top down. AKA, a lot of developers are using these tools now, right, without hiring architects, where you put in, okay, I need these numbers of rooms, it's going to be this height, it's going to be the square footage, etc. Click button, okay, floor plans. And so in this way, actually, there's so many generative AI tools out there that I think primarily work in a top-down kind of way, but is still frustrating in a very similar way that you mentioned at the very end. So with some of my explorations with bottom-up, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to, find some alternatives, kind of address some of those concerns that you were asking. I wouldn't necessarily say that the answer is to get a second AI. The answer is to get better human discernment, better human control over the process, maybe recognizing that the design process doesn't start and end with the AI, but rather, you have such a large toolkit as a designer. The AI might play some role here and there, but I do think that there is some sort of phenomenon, especially with like a lot of the AI hype, where a lot of the companies present the tools to you as if it's going to be the final solutions. And maybe that's why we are having these sort of discussions where, people are assuming such things. But I would say maybe an important takeaway from my experience has been that, no, it's just another tool. We've also been using a lot of other tools. There are a lot of things that we've learned about how to use those tools. Let's apply some of those learnings to how we're dealing with generative AI.
Wait, let's get a mic, and then we'll make this the last one. Oh, okay, gotcha. So two more, and then we'll...
Thank you so
Few
much.
questions.
I think my question, if people can hear it, is a follow-up to what you just said about tools, how you think of AI as a tool. I think this is the part maybe where I felt like your talk didn't really cover so much. But most tools, at least my assumption, this may not be true, is that they kind of shape how you think or your skills and whatever, right? And so there is a certain set of skills that you kind of like give away to the tool almost, like you give power to the tool to do certain things. And there are certain other things that you get more power on because the tool is handling those things. So I'm kind of curious, how do you see these tools that you've been using? Like, what do you see them amplifying? What do you see us, like maybe the human side of architecture, losing as a result of using these tools?
So actually, yesterday I had an awesome guest lecturer in my class who mentioned something. It really stuck with me, so I'm going to actually mention it in response to your question too, which was that when Industrial Revolution happened, so prior to Industrial Revolution, the way you made money was by selling your labor, which was moving heavy things and spending time doing so. But once Industrial Revolution happened and there are these machines, that kind of norm broke. And so you had to start selling something else, which began to be a bit more of your brain power. There's something maybe similar that could be happening with generative AI where like certain kind of maybe a bit more like tedious or procedural processes that were happening is like there is a shortcut now. But now everyone has access to this shortcut. So how are you going to distinguish yourself? It might be maybe the human brain again. I mean, again, that may be an optimistic take, I'm not sure. But I hope that that is kind of what ends up happening, where we can have some sense of discernment among different outcomes. And that discernment comes from maybe like a strong initial concept or something like that. Yeah.
There is one more question over here.
Hi, my name is Elsie, and I'm actually an interior designer, way back many, many years. I've seen how when technology came into play, and what I worry about is I've been to every year I've kind of tried to keep up with what's happening in the schools and what students are learning and all that sort of thing. And one of the things that I'm really worried about is that we all can be really great designers, but what we forget is that there's a responsibility when we design something new. And as an interior designer, I'm always worried about, well, how much am I throwing away? How much am I going to repurpose? And I know that there's a movement in Europe, in recent years that they're trying to repurpose things because there's so much environmental pollution. So one of the things that I have is just like in manufacturing and just like AI. Every time you use any tool to make something, are the school students being taught a responsibility, whatever they design, right? It should be something, as to his question, it should be something that will help us, not just help us as human beings, like, maybe somebody handicapped, you create something, but don't create something that, just like those phone companies, keep coming up with new things and then you throw it out, you can't recycle them. But I think there should be a responsibility that should be taught, that when they design something, don't design something that just because it's nice and it's going to make you famous maybe, or it's going to make you popular, but design something that is useful, that can last long, and then you don't throw it away and then get a new one. I know there are a lot of manufacturers that I've been working with, even in Europe and all of us. Like everything that we manufacture use water, and water has been a major resource that we're losing all around the world. So I'm just wondering, when you're teaching the students to use all of these AI, that's great, with the technology and all that. What kind of inspiration are you giving the students so that they're actually taking away with some of these knowledge and making use of them for the environment and the population in general, the world in general? I'm just wondering.
Sure, thanks for your question. So I would say a lot of my students are using generative AI whether I'm telling them or not. And so what I find to be part of my responsibility is actually trying to get them to use it a bit more responsibly so that it's not just contributing to just the production of more stuff in society. That said, obviously there's a lot of environmental issues surrounding use of generative AI. for which I don't have a very good answer for. But I do think that, okay, so when there was the internet boom and etc., from the earlier question here, something happened where you started generating so much printout or paper copies because it was so easy to. And there is something similar that is happening with generative AI where it's so easy to get out so many iterations. And so people are, instead of 10 iterations, it's thousands of iterations. And I don't think that's the right attitude for similar reasons that you brought up. And so I am very much interested in my courses, in my conversations with students, to try to get them to rethink this and try to, there is some sort of tendency, observe what's happening, try to reflect and analyze, and sometimes there's written assignments around this. Because you don't want to end up in a situation where it's just you get a million iterations but no outcome, and what was it all for?
Sort of reminds me of this, circles back to the question of decision, which you also could describe as a question of judgment. When do you know that you have hit, when have you arrived at the thing you want? I remember a lecture that Mineo gave decades ago when he showed, he was someone who appreciated Geary's work enormously, but he showed a grid of all the variations on the Disney concert hall. And though hard to imagine that he said this in the context of great admiration for Geary, but he said it's pathetic. All these variations, so many options. Why doesn't he know what he wants? Anyway.
There is a challenge. Yeah, that is a major challenge.
Before I thank you, Humbi, I wanted to say, just remind everybody, next week on March 5th, we have the Michael Huff Ontario Association of Landscape Architects visiting critic, Dr. Jala Makhzoumi, and she's an adjunct professor of landscape architecture at the American University of Beirut and acting president of the International Federation of Landscape Architects, Middle Eastern region. She's coming here to speak on landscape architecture and how it structures access and the right to the land. So please join us next week. But Humbi, thank you so much for sharing your work with us tonight and your thoughts. It was great. It's great to have you as a colleague here at Daniels. Thanks for your contribution.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you.